Good evening, everybody. My name is David Plylar in the Music Division at the Library of Congress. I'm so pleased to have you all here to see this wonderful performance we're going to have tonight. Some of you may have heard Paul Lewis when he was last at the library in 2013, when he gave a performance of 2 late Schubert sonatas. And tonight we're in for a great treat because he's going to be playing pieces that I know he loves, some Haydn Sonata, some works by Brahms, and of course the Diabelli variations, which is something you don't hear live too often, given the scale and stature of the work. I'm going to ask you just to bear with me. Since we last met, my voice has changed. I've got a kind of a monster cold, so I'm not. I'll do my best to be clear and not fade away too much here. So the overriding theme of tonight's talk is really, it's going to be mostly an overview of some of the pieces that we're going to be, all the pieces that we're going to be hearing. And I want to kind of emphasize this notion of planning for variation, or planning for variations in the case of the Diabelli, but also just the role that variation plays in the compositional process in general. When we think of variations, we think of a given theme or something like that, and then some type of modification to it. But there's this kind of a tightrope that has to be walked. Deviate enough, it becomes boring. So there's this kind of a two-pronged consideration that composers have to have when they're trying to do that, if their goal is for there to be a clear relationship to a particular theme. In the case of the Beethoven, which we'll get to in a bit, there is an element where he quite purposefully moves quite far away from it. It's still very much grounded in the theme itself, but he starts to do extra variational references, and we'll talk a bit about what those are and why he might do that. And so it's kind of this amazing thing to watch, and then to see how people continue to compose using these, having these models in place. We're going to start by looking at the Haydn Sonata that we're going to hear, the Sonata in E minor. This dates from the early 1780s. And one of the things that we're just going to point out is just how very clearly and immediately Haydn starts to use a motivic idea and vary it. I've just boxed a few of them. These are not, all of these examples are just bits and pieces that there's lots of other relationships that are there, but they're just calling out a few of these. So you'll see there in that top at the very beginning, there's this fast music, it's a presto movement, and you have these descending, we'll ignore the first one, but basically descending thirds and sixths, but groups of 3, and that's kind of the important thing. And then you have these other articulated groups of 3s. So those middle ones are given there. And then at the bottom, you can see a very clear articulation of the opposite, which is instead of going 6, 3, 6, it goes 3, 6, 3. And that's this bottom one right here, where you have still these groups of 3, and they're compressed together instead of having the rests that are in between the ideas up at the top. This is something that Haydn did, Mozart did, lots of people have done and still do to this day in terms of a type of variation that they might bring into play, and that involves creating spaces and then either expanding them or compressing them. At the same time, there's another type of thing going on, and right now I'm just thinking about contours and attacks. There's a 4-note bass line that rises at the very beginning, and it happens over and over again. There's 4 examples of it right there in that blue and at the top. You'll start to see that these this group of four is also in play down lower, where in there it's a bass, even though it's in the treble clef, it's the bass voice is being articulated as groups of 4 and 4. So this is something that gets played against each other often. We won't get into the weeds with how that happens, but that's an interesting thing, I think. Another type of variational technique that Haydn uses is one that's based on articulation. In this case, I don't mean specifically like staccato or something like that versus legato, but I do mean in terms of the indications, but I do mean like taking what's in that red box, shooting it up an octave, basically, and changing the texture and making it go from something that's a bit more strident to something that's a bit smoother in that green. I chose the soothing green for that type of material. All in all, it all sounds related, and it sounds natural, and then it keeps going from there. So these are some of the types of things that you might listen for in the Haydn first movement. The piece as a whole is in 3 movements, and the central adagio has a different type of variation that's highlighted, and that would be one of ornamentation or kind of fleshing out in different ways. But you'll still see certain things like compression. So for instance, the material that you see a turn at the beginning in the red box, followed by some eighth notes that outline a triad. Then if you go to the blue box at the end, you'll see the turn again, but you'll see a faster setting of those same, what were eighth notes now as sixteenths. So there's this component again of this is like a type of ornamental variation, because he goes on and keeps it moving and as a way of like keeping this relationship alive, but always pushing forward. This type of movement, as we'll find, is influential, I think, on Beethoven in quite a major way. These types of Haydn slow movements, and we'll see that a bit in the Diabelli variations. I had an alternative plan to show you some audible versions of this, but unfortunately that fell through. So I'll still try to give you some audible examples in a bit. But there's this amazing moment that you might want to listen for that I'm not going to be able to play for you right now, but where Haydn will incorporate certain types of motivic references with certain major harmonic impacts. And one is this moment in the slow movement when suddenly an E major chord kind of comes into the context of D. And so I know that's very abstract at the moment, but just listen for some interesting, slightly strange harmonic things going on there. Another thing that I'd like you just to be aware of, if you don't know this piece, is that you'll start to hear Haydn using the compass of the keyboard, using the entire compass of the keyboard, not just in terms of an accompaniment with a melody, but actually creating a melody that spans that entire compass. And here's one example of that type of a thing, where you have this high line that falls, you can see it falling, and then falls all the way down to that low D. And what is an interesting factor about these is that there's always this element of voice leading that goes into play with these, at least that I've found, where there's still like this, you see this bracketed bass line at the bottom where it shares that same final note with the melodic note. I don't hear that melodic note as ending at the 16th note. I hear it as ending at that low bass. That's just me. I mean, you might hear it differently, but it's kind of an interesting idea that a melody can now kind of break free of its registral bounds. And that was something that Haydn I think should get some more credit for as a kind of an innovator in terms of his keyboard writing. The final movement is a fantastic rondo, another fast movement. And I just boxed a couple of things. You'll start to see variations and repetitions of the same basic idea that comes back, and it's each one gets isolated and emphasized in different ways, and comes back as one expects in a rondo. We're going to be moving rather quickly just because of time, but moving on to the Brahms Intermezzi that we're going to hear. Well, actually, I should say before I get off of Haydn, we have in our display cases 2 of our Haydn manuscripts. So we don't have the E minor manuscript, but we do have 2 major autographed manuscripts. One is a Capriccio that was a fairly recent purchase, and then we also have the great E-flat sonata, a late sonata, and those are on display, so you have to be sure to take a look at those and see what you think. For Brahms, along those lines, we don't have any of the 3 intermezzi from Opus 117, but we do have a violin and piano version of the first one by Mario Castelnuovo Tedesco, whose collection we have. We have a lot of these interesting violin and piano transcriptions in particular, but we also do have other late Brahms. We actually have a ton of Brahms manuscripts, but some recent ones and related ones to these late pieces include Opus 118, number 1, Opus 119, numbers 1, 2, and 3. And I believe that Opus 118, number 1 is on display, as well as the Handel variations, Opus 24. So we have them from across the period of his life, but the focus for tonight is the Opus 117 set. And I say set because it's not just a collection like I think many of his other late collections are, where he kind of gathered up various pieces and put them together in an order that works dramatically. But these ones feel like they were intended to be a set. This is a bit speculative on my part, but that's what I'm hearing. Brahms took a break from writing. His Opus 79 Rhapsodies were, I think, 1879 or so. He didn't write as many solo piano pieces for a period of time until the early 1890s. He died in 1897, so he this was on his mind, and they make up a good portion of the final works of his. And there's something really magical about all of these pieces. They were certainly pieces that I grew up with, getting to know very early in my life, and I've always enjoyed them. There's an epigraph that Brahms put on the front of the first piece that I've listed there. That's basically kind of has made it clear that there's a certain lullaby component to this. So sleep quietly, my child, and etc. I do get, but the thing that's funny about this is that it's actually a very dark poem that it's based on. It's a Scottish ballad, but that Herder used in an anthology that Brahms drew on actually across his entire life. His Opus 10, Edward Ballade, from very early on in the 1850s, was also had a Herder reference. In that case, excuse me. But basically, it's a very anguishing long time for me when I have to listen to you cry, is what it's getting to. And you start to hear this. It's extremely sweet, lovely piece. He wrote, of course, the famous lullaby that everybody sings to their kid, or at least a lot of people do. Or maybe they don't anymore. I don't know. But this one starts off in this very innocent sort of a way, and then by the second measure, you have this low G that pops out in the bass. I like it when pianists bring it out a little bit. I don't know what Paul Lewis will do, but it starts to unsettle it and make it sound like there's a certain C minor tinge to it. We don't really go there too much. There's still this kind of a variation of this theme as it goes along until we get to the central section. But what we do see as we go along is that there's this connection between the sections. It's in a ternary form here, so it has the first part, a contrasting second part, and then a return to that first part. But as with most Brahms structures of this type, they're varied upon the return. Just as an aside, one interesting note is that the Opus 119 number 2 that the library just recently acquired, the original manuscript actually did not have a variant in the return. So the material was meant to be repeated, but with a coda. But then Brahms couldn't help himself, and so he made the changes later. But what you'll see is that between these, you'll see this descending line I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to sing it for you, but you'll see that descending line. There's these repeated E flats there, but there's a descending line that's the melody that you hear. And that comes back, and you can see that in that descending line in the blue box there. That's not to overemphasize that, but these types of links pervade his music. Another aspect, Brahms was kind of famously known for often putting 2 against 3 or 3 against 4, usually 2 against 3 on top of each other. But he's in terms of rhythms, but he's also doing that often metrically. So it's not necessarily an audible 2 against 3 that's something that you tap your hands to, but you'll notice that in that first upper left corner, there's those held E flat quarter notes, or groups of 3, against what ends up sounding like groupings of 2 going down, even though it doesn't quite look like it's groups of 2. That's just what it ends up sounding like. He does the same thing later in the piece at the end of the middle section. That's what you see in the upper right. And then you see that at the very end of the piece, too. He doesn't just do this for fun, but it actually is a way of kind of an overlapping type of variation that he'll do, where it not only serves to either slow down or speed up one's perception of the music that's occurring, but it also is a way to kind of further develop this idea of a repeated note above the melody that we see in the very first part, where you have those repeated E flats. But you have a quarter note, eighth note, quarter note, eighth note. But now they're varied in this way. Until the very bottom one, we see in that blue box at the very bottom an expansion to an augmentation to 3 eighth note beats instead of just the 2. So it's a way to slow things down and also kind of be a bit more dramatic, even within this very soothing, kind of more sedated context. The central piece of the set, the second intermezzi, and again, this title intermezzo is a very strange one. One doesn't usually encounter it. Schumann used it, Mendelssohn used it. There's certainly people who used it, but Brahms used it almost exclusively in the final pieces, with the exceptions of capriccios, a ballade, a romanza, and a rhapsody. It sounds like I'm making a lot of exceptions there, but a lot of these pieces were intermezzi, and it's strange because you think of them, an intermezzo as being something that happens between something. So if each piece is happening between something, what are they happening between? So maybe the middle one is definitely an intermezzo, but the other ones. But anyway, it's kind of an interesting way of thinking about music, is that these are kind of moments of reflection and pause. The central one is interesting and in some ways puzzling. What we hear when we listen to it oftentimes are those arrowheads are pointing towards what I hear is the melody that pops out. But there's also these bracketed groups of four that keep occurring. You'll definitely hear this. I've never heard a pianist not bring out those, but we can always be surprised. The reason that that's important, though, that those particular notes are pointing out, is that, again, this is another type of three-part structure. When we get to the middle section, we have basically the same type of melodic line happening in that upper voice. So up there, it's just in a major mode. So up at the top, you see that D flat to C, and then C to B flat. So just kind of descending scale. And then in the blue box, you'll see F to E flat to D flat. And then we're in D flat major there. But you still have this continued kind of, the red box is kind of this chromatic inflection that you can see from at the very top. It's something that he still keeps in this central section. The third piece is a piece that I'm particularly close to, just in terms of having lots of memories about it. And I remember, in particular, there's one of the first CDs that I ever got was, I think, Raphael Kubelik. I don't know if this is a pianist, but a really fantastic recording. And I just find this music extremely haunting. And so it's kind of like this lullaby that's like a dark lullaby. It's like one that is like a reflection on, one's final rest, perhaps. The things that I want to point out here briefly are the types of what I think of as orchestrating for the piano, the types of things that Brahms does. So at the very beginning, we have 3 octaves happening without any harmonic tones intervening. So it's just plain octaves. And there's something just extremely barren and, to me, haunting about this. Likewise, he doesn't, there's this stunning passage, I think, that happens that starts where the lower blue box is, where you have alternations of triple octaves and double going back and forth. It's one of those things that's subtle. I don't know that you necessarily hear it right away if you're not listening for it, but it's something that it creates this emphasis on those primary beats in a way that's just a very interesting choice, and one that's very, of course, conscious. And he does certain things with that throughout the piece. He also does something that I like to think of as, it's a terrible term, but chunking, where you'll take a little bit and just like isolate it as a chunk. And so I've isolated a few of those chunks that were previously smushed together to make the main theme, but have been spaced apart. And this is another type of variant that Brahms brings in. Another thing that he'll do is he'll take that idea that we see that I've circled and also label with an X, and he'll use that as a way of transitioning from section to section. There's an interesting, it says transition cobbler. I mentioned cobbler for a specific Diabelli reason that we're going to get to shortly. But it's a way of moving that fits for the piece. And I think that a lot of composers, that's important to them for whatever reasons. It doesn't want to, you have some composers like Mahler will do this, or Schubert, well, you'll just juxtapose something, and then that's the transition. There's no like transition, but composers like Brahms tend to like to make connections that make sense to them, and that usually means some type of motivic connection. I mentioned earlier that I think of this as more of a set than some of the other ones, and that's because there are some very clear relationships between them. I've got an example just from the number 1 up above and number 3 down below. If you just look at, just look at the contours of the melody at the very beginning, just has a rising C, D, E flat, and the bottom is C sharp, D sharp, E. It creates a very, doesn't take a genius to notice that this is a relationship that's very evident in what you're hearing. So it comes through very clearly, I think, and it pervades 1 and 3 in particular, but is also evident in the second one. There are also other types of connections between 2 and 3 in particular, and you'll see these, I've just isolated some groups of 4 that happened. But what's also interesting here, and this is something I think that Brahms picked up from Schumann, which is a tendency to have offbeat groupings, so that everything is just kind of shifted to the left, in this case, by a 16th note. So, I mean, you can imagine this music shifted just 1/16 over, and it'd be a lot easier to read. That'd be for one thing. So thanks, Brahms. But but he uses this to his advantage, and a lot of composers do too. But Brahms in particular will use this as a way to make the moment when he does bring it into alignment one of structural importance. So that's kind of a technique that I think he learned from Schumann. Okay, so getting to the major work of the evening, the Diabelli variations. It's impossible to give a really deep dive into this in just a few minutes, so I'll just do my best to give you a little bit of an overview about it. One thing that's really important to note right off the bat is that there's 2 dates there, 18, 19, and 23. And I'll explain why those are important. First, in 1819, you probably know the story if you've heard this piece and about how this came into being. Does everybody know the story about Diabelli? No? Okay. Well, then I'll repeat it quickly. Basically, Anton Diabelli had the idea. He was a amateur composer, but became a major publisher to basically solicit composers from around Europe to write a variation on a waltz of his. And so it's not a bad idea. It's something that other people have done after that. There's the famous Hexameron that came out later with Liszt and Chopin and Hertz and Pixis and Czerny. But this was kind of like the granddaddy of them, because he ended up getting a total of 50 variations. Excuse me. 50 variations that were published in 1824. We actually have a first edition of that at the library. And this included Franz Schubert, Franz Liszt, Karl Czerny, Hummel, Kalkbrenner, Moscheles, like major pianist composers, Mozart's son, and many more. Voracek, some Slavic composers. And anyway, they took to this theme and they created this thing. Beethoven was asked as well, and he's reportedly he has an unreliable reporter who said that he thought the theme was not any good. So, and it had these what he called cobbler's patches, where there'd be things that would be repeated and then go up a step and then repeat that and then up, something like that. I'm going to break out of this just so you can hear the theme. I think it's important to hear the theme that we're talking about. That's the cobbler. repeats again. But that's the basic theme. So you might think, okay, I can pull out, I could do a variation on that, no problem. So like that's what all these other composers did. But what Beethoven ended up doing was he wrote 33 variations on the, and it's about 50 minutes to 55 minutes in duration, and it's I think the thing that is the most astounding about the set, and it's it's one of those things where you want to avoid saying, oh, this is the greatest thing ever, but you kind of have to recognize that it's a significant achievement. Usually it's held up there next to the Goldberg variations of Bach as one of the great variation sets ever written. But why? I mean, it's such a kind of a, I don't know, like a profane in some ways kind of a theme. And what makes it, I think, the biggest accomplishment is that over the course of it, Beethoven explores this kind of entire human condition of these very earthly things, and then you also have these variations that are insanely beautiful and just really go beyond anything, or use extremely learned counterpoint, or other types of things, or isolate things in a way that hadn't been done before, or reference things that in a way that hadn't been done before. We'll hit a couple of those. But first, about this theme, and one other reason that I think that Beethoven might have been attracted to it. You'll notice that those things that, again, it's a bit scurrilous to say that it was the cobbler patch, but those are the cobbler patch things, those little, the repeated, the da-da-da-da-da-da, those things, sorry, I can't sing, but up in the top. You'll notice that this might be familiar to Beethoven, whose Opus 10, number 3, the finale of it, features that idea quite prominently and in a humorous way. And you can see that at the very beginning of that rondo, he has it spaced out with space, as one does with space. And then later on, you'll see that it actually rises in the same way that it does in the Diabelli theme. But then he'll also space it out and then hit you with a fortissimo presentation of it. Again, not exactly the same, but close enough to where it immediately jumped out to my ear. So I think that there might have been some nostalgia factor here that might have gotten into Beethoven's ear. So as I said, the two dates are important to keep in mind, 1819 and 1823. For a long time, people thought that Beethoven just started it in 1819, then decided to set it aside, and then did the bulk of the work in 1823. There's a fascinating study by William Kinderman that goes into the source material in depth, and it really is persuasive in the way that he deals with this, because it basically says that in 1819 he had an entirely different schema that included essentially 22 of the variations already in place, including the fugue at the end, but not including most of the final variations of the set. So it had a big chunk in the middle that was pretty much set. For some reason, whatever reason it was, he moved away from it. It's important to note what he moved away from it to, and that was to the Missa Solemnis, Opus 109, 110, and 111, the last three piano sonatas, and a few other things, but those are the main ones that he's working on. He moves away from Diabelli for that. He does those pieces, comes back to Diabelli, and then does the Ninth Symphony. So it's kind of a productive period for Beethoven. I mean, it's kind of a slagger, but we'll give him a break on that one for not finishing the Diabelli faster. So, but when one of the things that he was able to do when he did come back to it is he started to incorporate references to his own music and also to external factors. And by his own music, this is too much to get into right now, but in particular the Arietta from Opus 111. There's some very clear and interesting relationships between that and especially the coda, the final variation. But it seems like there's some interesting influences that go back and forth between this theme and what he's writing at the time, mostly having to do with these falling fourths and falling fifths that start to come through in the theme. So this variation 3 was actually his first variation that he was looking at, according to this other schema in 1819. And it's already actually quite different and kind of an interesting way to start it, but when he came back to it, he inserted this march variation, which at the from the very beginning is kind of an odd place to start. If you're just hearing this, if you're imagining hearing this piece for the first time, which is hard for people who have heard a lot to do, but it's kind of a startling way to, it kind of jolts you and gets you kind of into the mood there. Again, just to kind of quickly cover a few things, Beethoven would often isolate certain ideas and kind of focus on those for a particular variation. So here's an example where the theme is on the bottom, and you can see that little ornament that kind of outlines a turn. That's in the red box. And then he creates an entire variation of that, then variation 9. And it's kind of almost a mocking type of presentation of the material. One, I won't go into it, but you'll also notice that there are, you see a falling forth from, in the bass line of the theme from C to G. You start to see the same thing from C to G in the other one. So it's not just that he's isolating this one little ornamental idea. He's also, it has a harmonic and also a structural basis to it. When I say that, what I mean is that there's certain phrase lengths and things like that that stay relatively consistent, but then he'll change it and completely and do a compression or something like that as another type of variation. But sticking to this little idea, just so we can focus on one, he'll take that ornamental idea and transform it into a legato turn, as he does in the 11th variation that you can see again, theme on the bottom, variation on the top. Again, continuing with this, you also have this type of overlapping variation. So whereas in the theme, which again is on the bottom, you have the red turn, or the red ornament, and then you have these repeated chords in the blue. You can see those next to each other. Up in the variation 21, you have a variant of that ornamental material in the upper hand, or I should say, in the right hand, which then goes below the left hand. But then you have the repeated notes underneath it. So it's kind of, he does all kinds of these things that are very interesting and comical at times. Always interesting, though. And speaking of comical, he does a lot of basically parodistic writing. So it's, I don't think it's always meant to make fun, but it's, like for instance in this one we have whole spaces where there's just these silences. So you'll have this like big chords and then just silences. Big chords and silences. And some people say that this is to kind of make fun of the fact that there's not much happening in the theme. So it's just a you know, isolating those one little thing, and so he'll do that. But it also creates at the positioning. In this case, it's variation 13. It creates a dramatic break from what's happening before. So he's always thinking about, you know, as he's putting together the order and things, how is this going to impact what's around it? And speaking of that, there are certain variations that are variants of each other or incorporate types of variational material between them, or they share them. One example would be variations 16 and 17. I've just bracketed one of these repeated kind of figures that comes up there. It's derived from the theme, but it's been isolated as something in itself that then becomes something that one varies as well. And this is another aspect of variation technique that Beethoven is very good at, and that's not just that you're not always just varying relating to the theme, you're varying relating to the variations, the things that have come before. So in lots of, like a classical variation technique, you'll have, for instance, an acceleration over time. You'll like maybe have quarter notes that turn into eighth notes that turn into triplet eighth notes or something that gets faster and faster. And that's a type of the variation that I mean, where it's varying, it's speeding up progressively based on what came before. If you started with the really fast one, it would be a different effect. Beethoven actually does more of that latter than in this particular set than he did with the more classicist type. And then we have these other types of relationships that come through. And there are two main ones that people have identified. I mean, there's actually three major ones, but one that sticks out is the Mozart Don Giovanni, the very first theme, very first scene of the opera. This is basically it, and then he varies it, but it happens to share certain characteristics with the waltz, and so it's Leporello, the servant, who's basically saying, well, I want to be the master. I don't want to be stuck doing nothing and stuff like that. So it kind of makes you wonder: is this like this real big meta moment for Beethoven? And I think it is. I don't think. I mean, he's pretty explicit saying this is after this particular aria, and so he feels like maybe he's kind of a prisoner in this entire enterprise. And so, how does he get out of it? He starts to do something that's a bit more profound. Excuse me, in terms of the types of variations that he starts to pursue. There are two main fugal types of variations. One is this beautiful fugetta. Once you've heard it, you'll never forget about it. But the it's based it's in the sound world of Opus 110 fugue at the end. Well, it's in that sort of world, and that makes sense because that's what he was writing around this time as well. So it's beautiful. You'll like it. We start to get to the last variations that he added in 1823. He added a series. The last 5 variations are kind of pivotal, or of great importance. There's a string of 3 in the minor mode, and it's an they contain examples of kind of returning to a foundation in the theme. So you see in that red box there that there's this. This is that again, kind of erroneously calling the cobbler material, but it's basically that that's being isolated there, and you hear it that way, and it has this sort of reference that even though we've been kind of moving various times quite far away from what we might think of as the theme, there are certain references that pop out. The third to last variation is this really unbelievable largo, and so this piece is often, or this variation is often compared to the 25th variation of the Goldberg variations. There's certainly strikes me as being in the same kind of realm, but it's just a stunning piece on its own, and it's kind of one of those things where you're listening to it and you think, how is this part of what has come before? And that's again one of the stunning things about the set, is that it feels okay that is what it is. That moves into the penultimate variation, which is the big fugue. Not too big, but we start to hear, we look at what the fugue is made of, and he takes one of the most mundane components of the theme and makes it into a compelling fugal subject. And that's just that descending fourth followed by repeated notes. So you'll notice that in the theme up at the top, you'll see that C to G. It's the same thing, except now we're in E flat, and we're going from E flat to B flat. the fugue is something else. What's even more amazing to me is this passage that comes in the transition from E flat back to the C major of the theme. And this is leading into the final variation. And it's almost like he's able to suspend time in a way as he does this. I'm just going to go ahead and play this for you, but it's something that by the time you get to this point in the variation set, you feel this, I don't know, you just feel transported in a way, at least I do. I'm going to play a little bit of this just for you. I'll jump to it so you can hear it. There's the fugue. So it's this, it's really kind of short and direct, but basically reinterprets chord tones to like turn that B, that C flat into a B that leads to the C major of the final variation. And this one is a minuet, but it's very much sounds like it's in the. It sounds like the theme is just it's a transformation. It's like a noble transformation of the theme in some way. So it still has this. It still has this waltz feel, except now it's in kind of a minuet setting. Plus, there's a coda that goes along with it. Again, there are relationships here. Again, between the arietta and the coda in particular. People have speculated that one of the things that he's accomplishing across these final variations in particular is kind of a historical survey of music to that time, where he's showing what he can do in the Baroque idiom, especially in terms of contrapuntal mastery, as well as referencing his classical predecessors. So not just Mozart, but also Haydn, and also his contemporaries. There's a variation, I can't remember which one, that's seems like it's a pretty clear reference to Kramer, who was a contemporary of Beethoven's, who's one of the few pianists he actually admired, and Kramer has some studies that he seems to be referencing. There's also an element, though, that even though he does that, in a way, it's kind of like the Saint-Saëns Carnival des Animals movement, where it's the pianists, and it's like they start playing like hand exercises and stuff. And it's just kind of there's a certain funny component to it as well. And I'm sure that Beethoven was we always have this image of him as this gruff, kind of angry person, but you had to have a lot of humor to write some of this stuff, or at least a lot of gall. So he did have that. That's all I have for you today, but thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to try to take any questions you might have. I think my voice just died, so I'll take a few. If you could, if there are any questions, there's a microphone, but...
I'm curious about the transitions between the variations. You talked about the E flat major to the C major. Is there, I mean, in what you know of the composing, what does a composer think about transitioning, or what that transition is like? Are there pauses, or
Right.
does it flow, and how does that influence the start of the next variation?
That's a really good question. In the Diabelli variations, that particular transition is an important one because it's the only one that happens quite like that, where there's this actual significant change of key that's not just like a minor relationship where there actually is a modulation there. But the composers, and you'll find this with Beethoven in particular, there's a lot of juxtaposition of often, so a good number of these are in C major. So they'll happen one right after the other, but they'll, this is kind of like that shifting that I mentioned in the Brahms. You'll often find that there's a pickup to where the, let me see if I can just pull it up real quick. There's a pickup to, a pickup beat to the main theme. So you see the theme at the top there, and then by having a pickup, it allows you to kind of launch into the next one. So that's something that people do. That's just an example, but with variations, because they tend to be, especially if you're looking at classical variations, so like especially earlier Beethoven sets or things like that, you'll have it'll be fairly there's like a certain standard keeping to phrase lengths and things like that you don't have as much deviation as you start to have in some of these variations. So there's almost like it's like a plan that they follow, and it just feels right because it's keeping the normative going. I'm kind of babbling, but that made some sense. Excuse me. Yes, a meter can change. I don't think I have any examples here, but here's a good example. You start in 3/4. The very first variation is a duple march. So that's kind of a big deal. And that's what also makes it, that's another factor that makes it a striking choice for a first variation. So that in some ways that makes this an unusual set compared to what a traditional classical variation set might be. Excuse me. This one over here. Can you get the microphone? Sorry.
Do you think that Brahms learned anything from the Diabelli variations in his own love of variation form?
Absolutely, but I think that comparatively, Brahms variation sets are much more conservative, I think, at least in terms of the types of reference. They don't have this kind of freewheeling feel to them, at least to my ear. I think that so Brahms had this, after Beethoven, was probably I hate saying like most significant, but one of the great variation writers, and he did a lot of them really well. And you have, I think that one of the things that he would take away from Diabelli and others like it are what to do at the end, like how to deal with making a finale of it. And so you have, I think of like the ends of the two books of the Paganini variations, and those finale, they don't go into this sort of world, but like for instance the Handel variations that end with a fugue, and that's certainly, that has to be a Beethoven reference. So, but it's still different. I don't know. One more question.
Were the Goldberg variations known at that time?
Yeah, and it's thought that it's not confirmed that Beethoven had so the Goldberg variations were published 1741, I think, as a fourth of the Klavierübung of Bach, and they speculate that Beethoven had access to it. It certainly seems like he did, especially given. So there's been there's a book written about relationships between them. I don't know enough about. I haven't read that book, so I'm not. There's speculation though that maybe it's the relationships that they're pushing are maybe too far. There's also like speculation that the reason that there are 33 variations in the Diabelli variations is to kind of make this his last sonata in a sense, not like a sonata form, but he had the 32 sonatas, and this would be like the 33rd work. It's kind of a nice thought, but I don't know if there's any grounds for that. But in any case, to answer the question, I think that he did. Well, thank you all so much. You're going to enjoy this concert.